In the summer of 1944, as American forces prepared for the invasion of Saipan, the Pacific War entered one of its most decisive phases. Both Japanese and American commanders understood that the coming battle would determine far more than control of a single island. Saipan, positioned deep in the Marianas, offered the United States an opportunity to place long-range bombers within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. For Japan, losing it would mean that the strategic defensive belt protecting Tokyo had been irreparably breached. The stakes were clear, and both sides braced for what would become one of the most brutal campaigns of the war. By early June, American war planners had assembled a massive invasion force, an armada of warships, landing craft, and support vessels that stretched across the Pacific horizon. The troops assigned to the assault included the seasoned 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, joined by the Army's 27th Infantry Division. Opposing them on Saipan were elements of Japan's 43rd Division, naval landing forces, garrison units, and scattered auxiliary groups that had retreated from earlier island losses. Their positions had been reinforced across ridgelines, caves, and ravines, forming a network of defenses designed to delay American progress for as long as possible. Among the officers on the island was a senior Japanese naval commander who carried a traditional samurai sword, a symbol of rank, heritage, and the pre-war ideals embedded in the imperial military. He did not know that this weapon would become an unforgettable part of the battle's legacy. Before dawn on 15th June, American warships opened fire. Battleships and cruisers unleashed a bombardment intended to shatter Japanese coastal defenses, while aircraft from nearby carriers hammered bunkers, artillery pits, and airfields. The shoreline erupted under the impact of shells and bombs, sending pillars of smoke and debris into the morning sky. As the bombardment continued, waves of amphibious tractors and landing craft moved toward the beaches. Tension ran high. Intelligence briefs had warned the Marines that the landing zones were covered by interlocking fields of fire and that many Japanese positions had survived earlier strikes. When the first waves hit the beaches, the scale of resistance became immediately obvious. Japanese machine guns, hidden in fortified bunkers, opened fire with lethal accuracy. Mortar rounds fell among the landing craft, and artillery from concealed positions targeted the congested shoreline. In the chaos of the surf, Marines pushed forward through smoke, incoming fire, and underwater obstacles. For many, it was a fight simply to reach dry land. Those who did quickly established small pockets of resistance, holding ground against fierce Japanese counterfire while waiting for subsequent waves to arrive. By the end of the first day, the Marines had secured a narrow foothold, but the fighting inland intensified. Saipan's terrain proved as difficult as predicted. Jagged ridges, thick vegetation, and natural defiles offered the Japanese numerous positions from which to launch ambushes and delaying attacks. Their defensive strategy emphasized attrition, using every natural feature to slow the American advance. Throughout the island, isolated units chose to fight to the point of exhaustion rather than fall back. Among these groups was the naval officer with the ceremonial sword, positioned with his men along a rugged ridgeline overlooking a narrow ravine. Despite bombardment, hunger, and mounting casualties, his unit held their position long after neighboring formations had been overrun or lost contact. As American forces pressed inland over the next several days, the Japanese defensive network began to fragment. Communication lines collapsed, ammunition dwindled, and the combined effects of airstrikes, artillery fire, and infantry assault wore down even the most determined defenders. Isolated garrisons attempted to regroup, but often found themselves outflanked or cut off entirely. Some launched desperate night attacks, Others withdrew deeper into caves and ravines. The few remaining officers struggled to maintain coherence among their scattered troops. Late in the second week of fighting, American Marines reached the ravine that sheltered the remnants of the Japanese naval detachment. A bombardment during the night had collapsed portions of their bunkers, trapping some and forcing the survivors into exposed positions. At first light, Marines advanced cautiously, expecting resistance. Instead, they found a group of exhausted, malnourished men gathered outside the ruins of their shelter. Among them was the officer who carried the traditional sword. Accounts from Marines who witnessed the moment describe the scene as unexpectedly quiet. The officer rose slowly, removed his sidearm, and laid it on the ground. With deliberate care, he then unfastened his sword, its fittings ornate, its scabbard worn from use, and placed it beside the pistol. There was no ceremony, no speech, only a silent gesture that reflected both surrender and the weight of what surrender meant to a Japanese officer of his rank. To the Marines, many of whom had been fighting Japanese troops, who often chose death over capture, the act carried a significance that lingered long after the battle. The sword was collected and recorded as a captured artifact, one of many that would be sent back through military channels. But unlike most battlefield relics, this one carried a symbolic power that transcended its material value. It represented the collapse of a command, the end of a desperate stand, and a stark contrast to the ideology of refusal that had defined much of the Japanese defense. Yet, even as the sword changed hands, the battle on Saipan raged on. The Marines who witnessed the surrender returned to their units and continued the push northward. Snipers, hidden cave positions, and isolated Japanese groups still posed a threat across the island. The surrender of one officer did not mean the end of resistance. Instead, it marked a meaningful moment within a much larger struggle, one that would continue to exact a heavy toll on both sides in the days ahead. The invasion of Saipan began under conditions that reflected both the vast preparation of American forces and the deep desperation of the Japanese defenders. In the early morning hours of 15th June 1944, the combined power of the U.S. Pacific Fleet positioned itself just offshore, its battleships and cruisers firing sustained bombardment across the island's western coastline. The sound of naval guns rolled through the humid air, each shell tracing an arc toward entrenched fortifications that the Japanese had spent months constructing. For the Marines preparing to land, the bombardment was both reassurance and reminder. Reassurance that the island was being softened ahead of their arrival, and reminder that even such overwhelming firepower could not eliminate every danger waiting beyond the surf. When the first wave of Marines approached the beaches in amphibious tractors, the documentary tone becomes one of measured tension. The waves were churning with debris, smoke drifted across the landing zones from fires burning inland, and the ash-colored water showed the residue of bombardment. Japanese positions, despite being hammered for hours, remained capable of coordinated fire. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery emplacements opened on the landing craft. For the Marines inside, the moment represented what many understood as the defining threshold of the Pacific War. Stepping from an amphibious vehicle into a zone where the enemy held every advantage of concealment, elevation, and preparation. Once ashore, troops scrambled to establish an initial line of security. They moved through sand broken by shell craters and past obstacles that the Japanese had embedded into the beaches. Medics tended to the wounded as engineers began clearing mines and debris to allow heavier equipment to come forward. The steady, factual narration for this moment would note how American doctrine relied on rapid reinforcement. Within hours, More waves of troops and equipment landed, forming a widening beachhead that slowly began to absorb and redirect the intensity of Japanese fire. Beyond the beaches, the Marines encountered the varied terrain that would define the first phase of the Saipan campaign. Sugarcane fields burned under shellfire. Ravines cut intensely narrow paths through the interior. Shallow ridges offered natural defensive positions that the Japanese had further reinforced with overlapping arcs of fire. Each advance inland was met not by organized linear resistance, but by pockets of defenders who appeared from concealed tunnels, spider holes, and hardened bunkers. The Japanese strategy of delaying and attrition shaped every mile of the island. American commanders were aware of how these conditions repeated across earlier Pacific campaigns. Yet Saipan's defenders showed exceptional determination, often fighting until their ammunition was gone or until they were surrounded. Amid these scattered defensive networks, a small number of Japanese units held out in more concentrated formations. One group in particular included a senior naval officer who carried a traditional Japanese sword, a weapon representing lineage, duty, and status within pre-war naval culture. In documentary delivery, this detail is mentioned not to dramatize his presence, but to contextualize the symbolic significance of the weapon itself. Many Japanese officers serving in the Pacific carried swords that were family heirlooms. Others carried mass-produced military swords issued during the expansion of the Japanese Empire. In either case, the sword was intended to embody service, commitment, and the expectation of sacrifice. As American forces advanced deeper into the island through mid-June, the Japanese units in the officers' area of operations were steadily pushed back. Their ammunition dwindled, communication lines collapsed, and their ability to maneuver was restricted by sustained bombardment. The bunker complexes where they sheltered had begun collapsing under repeated hits from mortars and naval gunfire. Japanese commanders issued fragmented orders to regroup and hold at all costs. But the situation deteriorated rapidly. What had been organized defensive lines only days earlier had devolved into survival-based resistance. The Marines' movement toward these final pockets of resistance required clearing an increasingly complex series of defensive positions. Engineers burned out cave entrances with flamethrowers. Grenades were used to neutralize concealed tunnels. Machine gun teams moved in coordinated fashion to deny escape routes. In this environment, the documentary narration emphasizes the nature of systematic clearing operations. It was not rapid or impulsive. It was slow, methodical, and often carried out under difficult visibility conditions caused by smoke, dust, and terrain. By 22nd June, one such bunker complex was effectively isolated. During a sweep through the area, Marines discovered several Japanese soldiers who had survived days without adequate supplies. They were dehydrated, exhausted, and unable to continue fighting. Among them was the naval officer who carried the sword. When the Marines approached, he surrendered in a manner consistent with the end of an untenable defense. Not defiant, not ceremonially dramatic, but subdued. He laid down his rifle first. Then, with deliberate motion, he removed the sword from his belt and placed it on the ground. The weapon, ornate in its construction, had survived where so much else around it had been destroyed. The Marines retrieved the sword as part of standard intelligence collection procedures. Japanese officers' swords were often cataloged and shipped to rear area storage for examination. Many such weapons would later be redistributed as war trophies, donated to museums, or retained by units as historical artifacts. The narration acknowledges that this act, while symbolic of Japanese defeat, was also consistent with normal wartime practice. The officer himself was processed with other prisoners, receiving medical examination and being transferred to detention areas. While this individual surrender symbolized the collapse of that local defensive pocket, the broader battle for Saipan continued through June and into early July. Thousands of Japanese troops remained scattered across the island. Resistance continued in ridgelines, caves, and civilian areas where soldiers had mixed with non-combatants. The documentary tone underscores that despite moments of symbolic importance, such as the surrender of a high-ranking officer, the American forces still faced days of dangerous clearing operations. Each new area brought more concealed defenders, booby-trapped passages, and the ongoing threat of night infiltrations. By late June, the surrender of the officer and the seizure of his sword were understood by Marines less as an isolated event and more as a sign of the shifting momentum of the campaign. The Japanese forces, who had once believed Saipan could be held at all costs, were now facing the undeniable reality of American dominance in firepower, supply, and manpower. Yet the battle remained costly, and the Marines proceeded with caution and systematic planning as they continued their advance. As American forces pressed deeper into Saipan's interior, the battle moved into terrain that challenged every assumption about speed and progress. The western beaches had given way to farmland, cane fields, and scattered villages. But beyond them, the terrain hardened into ridges, cliffs, and a maze of volcanic rock. From the perspective of those advancing, the island felt like it was divided into layers, each one more exhausting than the last. The Marines and Army units knew they were pushing into the heart of Japanese resistance, and the Japanese defenders understood that every mile lost brought them closer to the final collapse of the island's garrison. In this environment, surrender, though still rare, became more frequent as isolated groups were cut off and ammunition dwindled. Yet many units remained fiercely committed, and even in the most weakened state, they fought from caves, tunnels, and ravines shaped by centuries of erosion. Among the formations still attempting to hold ground were the surviving elements of Japanese naval forces, including the officer whose sword had already become known among the Marines as a symbol of the desperate resistance yet to be broken. As days wore on, American forces began encountering groups of wounded or exhausted Japanese soldiers emerging from caves with hands raised, often pushed to surrender by starvation rather than command structure. Others remained hidden, determined to sell their lives as dearly as possible. These encounters created an emotional contrast that filtered into the documentary record of the battle. The relentless violence of ambushes and snipers, alongside the quiet moments when dazed, skeletal prisoners emerged from tunnel mouths too dehydrated to stand. Marines who had never seen Japanese soldiers surrender now found themselves escorting captured men to makeshift holding areas. The contrast underscored how fully the Japanese defense had fractured, even before the decisive Banzai Charge that would come later in the campaign. For the Marines advancing along the central spine of the island, the environment felt increasingly claustrophobic. The volcanic rock, dense vegetation, and cave networks gave defenders the capacity to disappear and reappear unexpectedly. A platoon might secure a ridge only to discover that tunnels beneath it fed into positions still occupied by Japanese troops. Night movements became especially tense. Marines described hearing movement in the darkness, sometimes only feet away, from men who had no intention of surrender and who waited for vulnerabilities in American lines. In this atmosphere, discipline and composure were essential. The layered narrative of Saipan, immense strategic importance, contrasted with the intimate details of individual survival. shaped how the battle would later be remembered by veterans and historians alike. Within this evolving landscape of attrition, the story of the Japanese naval officer and his sword became part of a broader pattern of cultural encounters on the battlefield. Marines who handled the surrendered officer noted the quiet dignity with which he removed the sword and placed it aside. Such gestures were retained in after-action notes and interviews, not because they altered the course of the battle, but because they represented a rare human moment within an environment dominated by destruction. To Marines who had spent days fighting unseen opponents across jagged terrain, seeing a senior Japanese officer surrender was not only unusual, it challenged the expectation that every officer would die rather than yield. The sword itself, with its polished fittings and careful craftsmanship, seemed to capture an entire worldview now collapsing under overwhelming firepower and logistical exhaustion. Even as this individual surrender was documented, the battle continued with full intensity. The Japanese High Command had no intention of allowing the island to fall quietly. Reinforced positions further north, supported by heavy weapons and interconnected cave systems, created formidable obstacles. From these positions, Japanese troops launched local counterattacks, often small in scale, but fierce in execution. The American military machine responded with the combined tools of modern warfare: artillery barrages, tank-supported assaults, demolitions teams, and flamethrowers that cleared cave mouths with terrifying efficiency. These operations were methodical and destructive, yet emotionally draining for those involved. Crews operating flamethrowers or demolitions often described the intense heat, the smell of scorched vegetation, and the eerie silence that followed when a bunker fell quiet. Amid these operations, the discovery and handling of the sword continued to resonate among Marines. Objects captured in war often carry meaning disproportionate to their physical presence, and in this case, the sword represented an entire structure of Japanese naval authority that had failed. As the Marines moved deeper inland, the sword was transported to a command post for proper documentation. Officers there recognized immediately that the weapon was not a mass-produced wartime sword, but a traditionally made, higher-quality blade. Such swords were often family heirlooms or carried personal significance. The realization added another layer to the story. This was not merely a functional weapon, but a deeply symbolic representation of status, training, and identity. Its surrender signified not only the defeat of an individual, but a moment when personal honor yielded to overwhelming circumstances. By the time American lines reached the central uplands, the Japanese defense was fractured into increasingly isolated pockets. Dehydration, heat exhaustion, and shortages of ammunition reduced many defenders to minimal combat effectiveness. American patrols noted that some enemy positions had ceased firing not because they were destroyed, but because the defenders were too weak to sustain resistance. Yet these same patrols also encountered areas where Japanese forces, even in desperate condition, launched sudden attacks intended either to break through American lines or force the invaders to expend resources. The contrast between fierce resistance and quiet collapse shaped the emotional texture of the campaign. For every bunker fight that required explosives and flamethrowers, there was another moment when Marines found abandoned equipment, silent trench networks, or small groups of starving civilians traumatized by days of bombardment. Throughout this period, news of the sword circulated informally among Marine units working to secure ridges and ravines. Some saw it as a personal humiliation for the Japanese officer. Others regarded it as a reminder of the unpredictability of war, that symbols of rigid hierarchy and cultural pride could be undone by hunger, fatigue, and circumstance. For others still, the sword was simply a war trophy, no different from helmets, flags, or personal items taken in earlier battles. But the consistent theme in Marine accounts was the striking image of a man who had carried a symbol of authority and honor, now surrendering it in defeat. The moment offered an emotional counterpoint to the brutality unfolding elsewhere across the island. As Saipan's defenders continued to falter, the American forces expanded their control methodically. Engineers built supply roads, medics tended to the swelling number of wounded, and support units cleared wreckage to establish temporary command posts. In daily briefings, commanders noted the steady shift of the battle's momentum. The Japanese command structure was clearly unraveling, and though isolated counterattacks persisted, the coherence of the defense had been irreversibly broken. The sword's surrender, though a small event in the vast scope of the campaign, became a symbol of this process, a moment when tradition and ceremony confronted the crushing force of modern industrial warfare. Despite the symbolic meaning attached to these events, the operational reality remained harsh. Every ridge, ravine, and cave required clearance. Supplies had to be moved under fire, casualties evacuated through rough terrain, and air support coordinated against positions often hidden from direct observation. For the Marines involved, each day brought its own emotional demands. They experienced fear, exhaustion, tension, grief, and sometimes brief surges of relief when a position finally fell silent. In this day-by-day progression, the story of the surrendered sword was a rare element of clarity, a reminder that somewhere amid the destruction, individuals still made conscious choices that carried emotional and historical significance. By the end of the third week, American units had reached positions from which they could see the northern plain, and beyond it, the sea. The battle had already claimed thousands of lives on both sides, and yet the final chapters, including the largest Banzai Charge of the Pacific War, still lay ahead. But among the Marines, moving northward, carrying their rifles, packs, and the indelible memories of what they had witnessed, the quiet surrender of the Japanese officer and his sword stood as a moment they would recount for years to come, an emblem of how even in the most violent campaigns, small encounters could illuminate the wider meaning of a conflict. As the battle advanced into its later stages, the American push across Saipan entered a phase defined by attrition, disintegration of resistance, and the steady collapse of Japan's organized defensive structure. By this point, the Marines and supporting army units had already overrun the coastal belts and forced Japanese units back into the inland ridges and cliffs. Each day brought the same rhythm: movement across blasted fields, clearing of cratered positions, and the gradual tightening of pressure against the shrinking defensive pockets. Yet beneath that seemingly linear progression were complex human moments, countless fragments of individual resistance or surrender, and the slow realization among Japanese troops that the battle for Saipan was slipping beyond recovery. The Marine advance reflected this, moving not only through terrain, but through the psychological remains of a defeated force. American commanders noted that Japanese defenses increasingly displayed fragmentation. Units that once operated under structured coordination were now split into small clusters, hiding in caves, ravines, and improvised shelters. Ammunition shortages had become widespread, and many defenders fought with minimal supplies, relying on captured ordnance or improvised weapons. The Marines encountered positions where rifles had been discarded because ammunition was gone, leaving bayonets, grenades, or blades as the only remaining tools of resistance. Among these positions, the few remaining organized groups often gathered around officers whose authority persisted more from tradition and desperation than from operational command. Those men, including naval officers like the one whose sword the Marines later captured, represented the last symbols of a military culture unwilling to concede defeat, even as its structures dissolved around them. The Marines advancing through this environment were themselves shaped by exhaustion and the cumulative strain of weeks of combat. Their progress across Saipan's fields and ridges took place under intense heat, through thick vegetation, scorched palm groves, and broken settlements. They faced periodic bursts of sniper fire, sudden ambushes from caves, and hidden machine gun nests in terrain that deceptively appeared empty. Casualties occurred not only in major engagements, but in these intermittent, tense confrontations where seconds of silence could break into violence. Voiceover describing these scenes typically emphasizes the environmental harshness and the emotional restraint common in infantry accounts. The knowledge that each cave or clump of vegetation might conceal a defender willing to fight to the death, or perhaps one who only moments earlier had considered surrender but still feared the consequences. Into this landscape came the steady work of cave clearing, a task that defined much of the Marines' inland advance. Teams armed with flamethrowers and demolition charges proceeded methodically, sealing or neutralizing defensive hideouts. The process was direct but deliberate. Requests for surrender called into the darkness, pauses to listen for any reply, and then the final decision, when silence or defiant shouts made clear that resistance would continue. The flames or explosives that followed often revealed shattered remnants of Japanese units, huddled in collapsed chambers, exhausted and disoriented. Occasionally, survivors emerged after the fact, stumbling into Marine lines hours or days later, stripped of equipment and driven by hunger or shock. Others, still adhering to military tradition, surrendered more deliberately, bowing, presenting empty hands, and signaling acceptance of capture. These moments carried a quiet tension shaped by the enemy's long-standing reputation for fighting to the last. But they also provided opportunities for field interpreters or Marines with previous Pacific experience to communicate terms of surrender, reinforcing that such moments, while fragile, could be trusted. It was in these later stages of the battle that the symbolism of the captured sword took on deeper meaning within Marine units. Word circulated about the naval officer who had surrendered it with a composed but unmistakably resigned demeanor. For the Marines who witnessed it, the act signaled an unusual break in the pattern they had come to expect, an officer choosing surrender over suicide or continued resistance. The sword itself, photographed and cataloged soon after its capture, became a piece of tangible evidence in after-action reports, proof that even within the rigid culture of the Imperial Japanese military, the realities of defeat had begun to erode long-standing codes. The documentation was thorough, noting the sword's length, ornamentation, and condition, not as a trophy, but as part of the larger narrative of Saipan's downfall. Yet even as isolated officers surrendered, many Japanese troops continued to fight with a determination shaped by military indoctrination, fear of disgrace, and pressure from their own superiors. This persistence required the Marines to maintain constant vigilance. Units advancing through fields of volcanic rock or along slopes that fell sharply into ravines had to expect sudden resistance in any direction. Observers in Marine units described the landscape as shifting unpredictably between silence and confrontation. One moment offered nothing but stillness and the distant sound of artillery. The next brought a rifle shot from an unseen position or a desperate charge by soldiers determined to break out of encirclement. The emotional tone of these accounts is restrained, measured, and matter-of-fact, reflecting not dramatization, but the sober recognition that every step forward required discipline and awareness. As the pressure increased, Japanese commanders faced their own dilemmas. Radio communications had deteriorated, supply lines were non-existent, and the scattered remnants of divisions could no longer mount coordinated offensives. Reports from American intelligence units indicated that some officers attempted to regroup smaller units for last-stand positions, while others organized localized suicides or encouraged troops to fight until the end. Civilians trapped on Saipan, many coerced or controlled by Japanese troops, faced their own suffering, caught between advancing American forces and the propaganda that had long told them that capture meant torture or death. Marines encountering civilians had to manage not only the tactical environment, but the humanitarian challenges created by Japanese command decisions. Voiceover, in documentary style, typically highlights these humanitarian dimensions in calm, reflective terms, noting that civilian casualties were a tragic and unavoidable element of the battle's final phase. By late June, American units had reached many of Saipan's decisive ridges and defensive centers. The Japanese lines had fractured beyond repair, leaving small, desperate positions attempting to delay the inevitable. As Marines advanced into these zones, the remnants of organized Japanese resistance became sporadic and disconnected. Some positions surrendered immediately upon contact, their occupants too weakened or disoriented to continue. Others launched desperate, isolated attacks that ended quickly in the face of overwhelming firepower. In positions where officers had surrendered earlier, such as the one involving the sword-bearing naval officer, morale among remaining troops collapsed more rapidly. These localized breakdowns fed into the broader disintegration of Japan's defensive posture. What had once been a unified command committed to holding Saipan had been reduced to pockets of individuals making isolated choices about survival. The Marine advance during this phase reflected a pattern recognizable in many Pacific Island battles. The final collapse of resistance was less a singular moment than a gradual erosion of structure and will. The symbolic moments, the surrender of an officer, the capture of a sword that had once embodied a warrior's status, were woven into a larger fabric of systematic clearing and steady progression. By the time the Americans approached the northern cliffs and final defensive terrain, the momentum of the battle had shifted decisively. The outcome was certain, yet the violence continued, shaped by the terrain, by desperation, and by cultural expectations embedded in the minds of the remaining defenders. The Marines, aware of the approaching conclusion, navigated these final days with caution, discipline, and a recognition that even as collapse occurred, danger remained embedded in every cave and ridge still under Japanese control. As the battle for Saipan pushed into its final phase, the island had become a vast landscape of ruins, shattered cliffs, and burning vegetation. The once dense jungles were torn open by shells, the cane fields flattened by tanks, and the ravines choked with the remnants of bunkers that had collapsed under bombardment. For the Marines still fighting, there was a growing awareness that they were participating in something larger than a single island campaign. The capture of Saipan was not only a tactical victory, but a strategic breakthrough that would reach all the way to Tokyo. Yet on the ground, the realities remained harsh. Clearing operations dragged on, the wounded required evacuation, and Japanese pockets of resistance refused to surrender quietly. Even in these final days, the island fought back with desperation and grief. Across the shifting front lines, Marines moved through terrain where danger could still erupt without warning. Machine gun nests, thought destroyed days earlier, sometimes reopened with sudden bursts of fire. Snipers in the rocks, fired single, deliberate shots, forcing entire companies to halt. The prisoners taken in the final stages appeared exhausted, bandaged with scraps of cloth, and often starving after weeks of shortages. Many were in shock. Their morale long since broken by the collapse of organized defense. To the Marines who encountered them, these scenes served as stark reminders that even when the momentum of war had clearly shifted, the cost of each yard remained steep. Every captured ridge was paid for in sweat, blood, and the steady resolve of units that had begun this operation weeks earlier on the beaches under fire. In the midst of this grinding work, the story of the Japanese naval officer's sword continued to ripple through Marine ranks. The weapon, removed so carefully at the moment of surrender, became a kind of symbol among the men who heard about it. To some, it reminded them of the cultural depth of the enemy they were facing. The traditions, honor systems, and symbolic items carried into battle. To others, the sword represented the collapse of an ideology that had demanded no surrender, only death. A Marine might see the weapon and remember the ferocity of the earliest days of the invasion, when Japanese forces had fought with a certainty that they would repel any attack. Now that same ideology lay shattered at their feet, captured in steel, stripped of its authority. The emotional weight of this transformation was not lost on the men who had fought through the mud, heat, and fire to reach this point. Even as the Marines pressed deeper into the interior, the consequences of the island's collapse began to unfold among the civilian population. Thousands of Japanese civilians, many of them families of soldiers, others local islanders, coerced by military authorities, were caught between the rigid demands of the Japanese command and the steady advance of American forces. Rumors spread among them that the Marines would commit atrocities, rumors encouraged by Japanese officers to prevent surrender. As a result, civilians fled toward cliffs, ravines, and hiding places. In some of the most tragic scenes of the Pacific War, Marines witnessed civilians attempting suicide rather than fall into Allied hands. The psychological shock of these events left many Marines shaken. The war had been brutal before, but now its emotional toll became more visible than ever. The sword, the officer's surrender, the unraveling of a battered military force. These were easier to process than the scenes of civilians driven to despair by propaganda and fear. American officers, medics, and interpreters began to intervene whenever possible, broadcasting instructions through loudspeakers and sending Japanese-speaking personnel forward to reassure civilians that they would not be harmed. Slowly, the tide of fear began to recede. Groups of civilians emerged from caves holding white cloths or raising hands in surrender. Marines provided water, rations, and medical treatment. These moments contrasted sharply with the violence of earlier weeks, and voice-over narration in a documentary would naturally highlight the emotional turn, the exhaustion in both liberators and survivors, the relief that swept over units who had been fighting for weeks without rest, and the realization that the island was finally shifting from battle to aftermath. With the highlands secured, the last organized Japanese formations prepared for what they believed would be their final stand. The decision came from the highest surviving commanders on the island. They resolved to launch a massive final counterattack, a Banzai Charge involving thousands of men, including wounded soldiers who were given weapons or even carried on stretchers so they could die facing the enemy. The attack crashed into American lines in one of the largest Banzai assaults of the entire war. Marines and Army units fought hand-to-hand through the dark, overwhelmed at times by sheer numbers, but eventually repelled the attack with staggering losses on both sides. The emotional intensity of this moment is central to understanding the final days of Saipan. As narrated in a documentary, the scene would emphasize the clash of willpower, the desperation of the attackers, and the somber determination of the defenders who knew this was the island's last violent convulsion. When dawn broke after the Banzai attack, Saipan lay quiet in a way that had not been felt since the invasion began. Scattered gunfire still echoed from caves, but the spirit of resistance had effectively collapsed. Marines began systematic clearing operations, moving carefully through the last pockets of holdouts who often chose suicide or refused to respond to calls for surrender. Throughout these final sweeps, the memory of the Japanese naval officer's surrender lingered in the minds of the Marines. His sword, shipped back and recorded as a war trophy, stood in sharp contrast to the violence that had unfolded in the last days. The scene of him laying down the weapon seemed almost gentle compared to the bloody desperation of the final Banzai Charge. The capture of Saipan had consequences far beyond the island itself. Strategically, it placed the Japanese home islands within direct reach of American long-range bombers. B-29s, once based on Saipan and nearby Tinian, would carry out raids that reshaped the rest of the war. Politically, the fall of Saipan triggered a crisis in Tokyo that toppled the Tojo government. Emotionally, for the Marines who had fought through the invasion, it solidified the knowledge that they were advancing into the final chapters of the conflict. For documentaries, this transition marks a powerful shift from the intense human experience of frontline combat to the broader implications of a turning point in the Pacific Campaign. By the time Saipan was declared secure, the island had taken on the look of a battlefield monument. Tanks lay burned out along ridges. Wrecked Japanese guns pointed toward empty coastline, and the smell of smoke lingered over cleared fields. Marines walked the terrain slowly, processing the cost, the effort, and the meaning of what they had achieved. Amid the debris, stories like that of the sword survived because they offered something tangible, a moment in which centuries of military tradition collided with the unrelenting reality of modern mechanized war. It was a symbol of bravery, collapse, surrender, and survival all at once. Its journey from a Japanese officer's hands to an American trophy room mirrored the trajectory of the battle itself, the passing of an old order and the rise of a new strategic reality. When historians later revisited Saipan, the story of the sword gained renewed interest because it humanized the larger conflict. It reminded researchers and viewers that beneath the vast movements of armies and the great shifts of strategy were the experiences of individuals caught in a war that reshaped nations. In documentary voiceover, this idea becomes central. The war was fought by men with personal histories, cultural symbols, and deeply held beliefs. The Marines who captured the sword did not merely acquire an artifact. They witnessed the collapse of a worldview and the surrender of a man who carried centuries of tradition into a modern battlefield that could no longer accommodate it. Saipan's story ended with victory, but not triumphalism. Even in the moment of success, the Marines understood the war was far from over. Ahead lay Tinian, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, battles that would demand even more from those who survived. Yet Saipan remained a milestone, a turning point, where the United States broke through the defenses of the Japanese Empire and stepped firmly onto the road that would lead, eventually, to the end of the Pacific War. And among the countless stories left behind in the rubble and ridges, the tale of the surrendered sword endured because it captured both the tragedy and transformation of that pivotal moment in history.